Welcome to God's house, and welcome to Good Friday. You know, over the years, I think we've gotten to the point where we really focus a lot on Easter Sunday, and that's the way it should be. I mean, Resurrection Sunday is the most important time of the year. But sometimes I think we pay short shrift to what gets us to Easter Sunday, and that's Good Friday. And Good Friday has always been a big thing in my family. When we were kids, Mom used to take all of us. Finding a place to put 6 kids is kind of tough, but she assigned each of us our own little space from noon to 3 o'clock. No radio, no television, nothing. Just focusing on what Good Friday meant. So tonight, what I'd like to do is spend some time in what I'm calling the final hours, that final few hours in Jesus' time. And to do that, we're going to kind of meld the Gospels together, because all 4 Gospels talk about the events of what happened here. In fact, all 4 Gospels spend about a third of their entire Gospel message on the last week, the Passion Week, beginning on Palm Sunday. John has the longest, and John spends almost all of his time, or a good portion of his time, in what we're going to do tonight, which is from the Last Supper to the crucifixion. So that's where I want to focus tonight, on the final hours. And we're going to talk about some things that are in the Gospels, but we're going to flesh them out a little bit more, so we understand a little bit more about what happened in that critical period of time between the Last Supper and Jesus' last breath. Let me start us in prayer. Father God, thank you for the gift of your Son, Father. We look forward with great anticipation, Father, to Easter Sunday, Father, to Resurrection Sunday. But tonight, Father, I pray you'd come among us, Father, and guide us and show us, Father, what occurred to your Son and his followers in those hours, Father, those painful hours. And I pray, Father, that you would touch each of us here, Father, that when we leave, we would understand even more deeply what the sacrifice of your Son meant. And I pray all these things in your Son's name. Well, I said we were going to start out with the upper room. And in the upper room, obviously, one of the most important things to happen is the Lord's Supper. But there's actually 3 or 4 other events in the upper room that we sometimes lose sight of that I wanted to spend a little time on. So we're gonna invite you to join us in the Lord's Supper here in just a minute, and the gentlemen are going to get the elements together for us. I would ask you this. The Lord's Supper is, in Christendom, probably the holiest, is the holiest moment of all Christianity. So I'm going to ask that if you have said Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, you join us in the Last Supper. If not, if you have not yet, I'm going to ask that you just let the elements pass you by. Now, while they're doing that, let me hit a couple of other kind of major occurrences during this significant events, I guess I'll call them that, during the Last Supper. And the first one is this, and we should probably note that when this occurs, so I'll try to get you a timeline as we go along here. This is actually Friday morning. Now, you're going to be surprised when I say Friday morning. It's Thursday night, but in Judaism, the day begins at sunset. So we're actually, by the time we get to the Last Supper, we're actually into the wee hour, or the first hours, not the wee hours, the first hours of Friday morning. It's going to be at sundown. We would think of as sundown on that Thursday, call it the 6, 7, 8 o'clock, whatever time sundown happened, which is when the events begin to occur. Now, we know about the Last Supper, but what we may not know, or we may not think about so much, is what happens in John's Gospel. John's Gospel has something in the Last Supper that none of the other Gospels have, and that is this. the washing of the disciples' feet. In fact, many know the name for Thursday, for Holy Thursday, as Maundy Thursday. Maundy simply means washing. So John takes his disciples aside and he girds himself, and then he goes around and washes the feet of each of the disciples. Well, you might be thinking, why is that a significant event? Why should that mean anything to us? He's washing their feet. Here is why. The most lowliest of the servants had the job of washing the feet of the guests as they came into the room. And the reason was, it was their feet that got dirty as they traveled. So before the meal happened, the lowliest of the servants would come and wash the feet. Jesus girds himself up. He's the rabbi, and he goes around to each of the disciples. In fact, you might recall Peter says, "Not my feet, you're not going to wash." We're going to talk quite a bit about our firebrand Peter. I wish I had just 1/1000th of the zeal of Peter, but he sometimes can be a little impulsive. So Peter says, "Not my feet." And Jesus says, "If not your feet, then you have no part with me." What was he doing to his disciples? He's really showing them what servanthood looks like. He's showing them what's going to happen in their lives. So that's the first kind of major event here. We've got kind of 4 of them that we want to talk about. All 4 of the Gospels talk about Judas's betrayal. Now, I've often wondered, why would a disciple betray Jesus? We don't know, but we can kind of summarize this, or we can guess this much. Most of Israel was looking for a warrior king. They were looking for somebody who was going to throw off the oppression of the Romans and bring Israel back to its glory days. We can only surmise that perhaps that's what was going on in Judas's mind. I don't know why. All I know is all 4 Gospels record it. All 4 Gospels tell who is going to betray Jesus. And then the third item that happens here that's of significance, Jesus says, after he says, somebody's going to betray me, our firebrand stands up and he says, "Not me, Peter, not me. It's not going to be me." And Jesus says to him, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Well, we're going to find later that happens. But Peter, at this point, thinks, how can that possibly be? Now, those are 3 items. Now we come to the 4th item. And the 4th item is the Lord's Supper. Now, remember I said this is the Last Supper? Well, if it's the Last Supper, how can it be the Lord's Supper? Here's the reality. It's most likely that this meal followed kind of a format of what we would call a Seder dinner. And it began with certain prayers and went through the course of the dinner. There would be 4 different times when there would be a raising of the glass of wine and a dedication of some type. This is probably the 4th. This would be the last of the dedications, the last of the raising of the wine. And this is where Jesus stands up and he says to his disciples, and I'm going to read it from Matthew. He says to all 4 of the Gospels, now I started to tell you a fib. John's Gospel is the only one of the Gospels that does not include an account of the Last Supper. The 3 Synoptic Gospels do. Most believe that because John was written so much later that he didn't think there was a reason to do it. So all 3 of the Gospel accounts have it. And here's how Matthew says it. And so, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take and eat. This is my body." Matthew goes on, and he records Jesus saying this. Then he took the cup, and he gave thanks, and he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood, the blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom." This is my blood. Matthew records that at that point the meal was over. They went outside. They sang a song first and went outside. And the upper room was in Jerusalem. So they would have left the upper room. They would have left Jerusalem, probably walked down the southern stairs where much teaching took place. And I have to think in my mind, what was it that the disciples had to have been thinking? It's kind of a strange toast when Jesus says, my body's going to be broken for you and my blood's going to be shed for you. You have to think, what were they thinking? Jesus was simply telling them what's going to happen over the coming hours. He's simply saying to them, be prepared, for this is going to happen. They aren't prepared. They won't be prepared. That's going to take us to our second stop. Our first stop is the upper room. Our second stop is going to be Gethsemane in the Mount of Olives. Let me kind of give you an idea of what that might be like. The Temple Mount, or Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives is separated by a valley called the Kidron Valley. So kind of picture in your mind, and you'll get an idea of what occurred from there. Picture yourself at the chapel at Fort Lewis, coming down the stairs and the trails at Fort Lewis, across the valley, and coming up behind us here on Crestview. That would be very similar to the trek that they made. It's a little closer in Jerusalem than that, but they're about the same elevation. So from the Mount of Olives, they're able to look across and see what was in the temple. This is going to be, I don't know, let's call it 9 to 11 o'clock or something like that. Now, there are three significant events that happen here. The first is these. John records, all of them record that Jesus prays. This is the pericope that we all talked about where Jesus prays and he comes back and he says, can't you guys stay awake just for a little while? 3 different times. Well, John tells us what it is he's praying for. The first time he prays for himself. And this is where the gospel accounts will tell you he's sweating blood. The second time he's praying for his disciples because he knows what they're about to face. The third time, he prays for all other believers. And there's a line in John that says this. Jesus is talking to the Father, and he says, I want them to continue to make you known. Well, make you known to who? The Great Commission tells them later on, after the resurrection of the Great Commission, he says, make disciples of all nations. And that word would have been rendered ethnos, all peoples. Not only during that period of time, but in the Greek it would have been now and forevermore. So when Jesus says, make you known to them, he's talking about you, and you, and you, and you. So his prayer is for all who will follow him. Now, that's the first major event. Here's the second major event that happens in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's the arrest. Now, oftentimes we see, and if we watch a television show about it or something, we often see that the people that come to arrest him are Roman guards. That's not who came. Who came were called the temple guard. In other words, these were Jews, just like Jesus. Probably many of them saw the same miracles, yet their job is to go to arrest him. So Jews, his fellow countrymen, are coming to arrest him in the garden. Here's the third thing that happens, and it's related to that. Our firebrand Peter jumps up, and what does he do? He pulls his sword, right? And he slices off the ear of one of the soldiers. Well, all four Gospels give us that account. But John and Luke add a piece of information that the others don't have. John says his name was Malchus. Pretty impressive that the Gospel writers named people that occurred here. The second thing is even more impressive, and Luke says that Jesus just touched the ear of Malchus and healed him. I don't know about you, but if I'm in the temple guard and I watch somebody just heal somebody and put their ear back in place has just been lopped off with a sword, I'm starting to think maybe I'm on the wrong team here. Unfortunately, they don't. They bind Jesus and they take him. And that's going to take us to our third stop. Our third stop are trials, the trials of Jesus. There's actually 4 trials. The first, kind of a nondescript one. The first one is to a man named Annas. Annas was the chief priest. Subsequently, his son-in-law, Caiaphas, becomes the chief priest. Many believe that Annas was forced out of the office by the Romans and Caiaphas took his place. Many Jews still look to Annas for direction. Doesn't really make much difference. The point is, first Annas and then Caiaphas, the 2 chief priests, the 2 that should have known about everything in the Old Testament that prophesied the coming of the Messiah, those are the 2 who take him to task. So the first event was the questioning by Annas and Caiaphas. Subsequently, around daybreak, Caiaphas takes Jesus before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was kind of like the ruling group of Israel at the time, mostly composed of Sadducees, some Pharisees in the mix, but mostly Sadducees. The Sanhedrin is the ruling group. And Caiaphas takes Jesus before the ruling group, and he says to him plainly, he says, "Are you the Christ?" Well, Jesus can't lie. He's through kind of playing around with him. And he says, "Thou sayest it." What does Caiaphas say? "Blasphemy! Blasphemy!" He rips open his toga and he screams blasphemy. Everybody else starts screaming blasphemy. Here's the reality. It was blasphemy. Unless it was true. Well, the penalty for blasphemy in that period of time was stoning to death. We have a problem here. Israel's an occupied nation. Rome has occupied Israel. They don't have the ability to put anybody to death. So that's going to take us to our next trial. Caiaphas says, send him to Pilate. Now, I want you to remember the setting here, because this is a Passover. It's one of 3 what are called pilgrims' feasts, when all of Israel, all practicing Jews, were to come to Jerusalem to pray and to celebrate the Passover. That means there's 1 million, 1.5 million, I can't tell you how many, but there are a boatload of Jews in Jerusalem to celebrate. And we often think that, Pilate has control of things. Actually, the Roman garrison in Jerusalem at this point is a very small contingent. So Pilate's put in a pretty tough position. On one hand, he's got a riotous crowd of however many, and on the other hand, he has a fairly small group of soldiers to protect him. So Pilate goes through his questioning, and finally he says, I don't find any fault here. I don't see anything wrong. What am I supposed to do? And one of the gospel accounts says that somebody tells Pilate he's a Galilean, and Jesus says, "Are you a Galilean?" And he is. He's from the region of Galilee. Pilate thinks, I got a way out of this. He knows that Herod Antipas is just down the street there to celebrate the Passover. So he bundles them off to Herod Antipas, thinking, oh, I got out of this. Well, Jesus comes before Herod Antipas. First time, as far as we can tell, that Herod Antipas has seen him. Herod Antipas, by the way, is kind of the civil authority. If Caiaphas is the ecclesiastical or the church authority, Herod Antipas is what would be the civil authority. So also a very powerful man. And Herod tries to ask him questions, and Jesus refuses to answer. He keeps quiet all the time. I believe that that's because Jesus recognized that Herod Antipas was not a Jew. Herod Antipas was something called an Idumean. He comes from the line of Edom. He comes from the line of Esau. Jesus refuses to answer him. So Herod Antipas sends him back to Pilate. That's the fourth trial. Now, Pilate. Pilate's put in this tough position now, isn't he? And so in the last trial, the one before Pilate, Pilate says to the Jews, look, I can't find any fault with him. Herod sent him back. He can't find any fault with him. I'm just going to release him. And the crowd foments. The crowd starts yelling and chanting and yelling and chanting. Well, eventually, Pilate comes up with another idea. Look, we all know that in this festival time, I have the ability to release a prisoner. Pilate's thinking, I'm going to get to release Jesus, right? Not the way it works, is it? What happens? The crowd starts yelling, Barabbas, Barabbas, give us Barabbas, release Barabbas, crucify him, release Barabbas. All four Gospels record Barabbas being released. I want to come back to Barabbas because the reality is that's going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about for almost the rest of this message. But we can't do that until we finish our story. We're going to go to our fourth stop on our tour, and that's something called the Praetorium. Now we're probably mid-morning, let's say 9 o'clock in the morning on Friday. The Praetorium is located right next to Pilate's house, and it is where the Roman troops are garrisoned. It's also where prisoners are kept. It's also where prisoners are punished. So our fourth stop is going to be the Praetorium. And at the Praetorium, we have three significant events. And the first one is this. Jesus is flogged. Now, we often see in TV and movies and stuff, we see a bullwhip taken out, and we see Jesus flogged with his bullwhip. I'd like to say that's what happened. It didn't. What was used was something called a flagellum. So Jesus is actually whipped with something like this. Oh, the strands might have been a little longer, but it looked like this. It was called a cat o' nine tails. The Romans used it. And it was, the Roman name is flagellum. Well, you might notice there's kind of some shiny objects on the ends of these things. The flagellum was woven with sharp metal pieces, so that when you got the lashes across your back, the sharp metal pieces dug into the flesh. The Gospels don't record the number, but probably 39 lashes. Picture 39 lashes across your back with sharp metal pieces in them. That's the first thing that happens in the Praetorium. The second thing that happens in the Praetorium is the guards make a nice crown for the King of the Jews. Someone made this one for us some time back. This is actually barbed wire. This is actually a little easier than what really was made, because the thorns on the crown of thorns were probably anywhere from 1.5 to 2 inches. And they place it on Jesus' head. And they mock him by saying, King of the Jews. So they crown Jesus with the crown of thorns, and blood begins to stream down his face. So now we've got Jesus bleeding from the back. We've got Jesus bleeding from the crown of thorns. And then there's a third thing that happens, and that's this. Jesus is given a cross to carry. Our little cross here is a pretty good representation, but there's a problem with it. Our cross is about half the size of the real cross. Archaeologists will tell you that the Roman cross at the time was at least 9 feet tall, had a wingspan of anywhere from 5 to 6 feet wide, weighed 300 pounds. We'd probably be better if our cross was some railroad ties, wouldn't we? Those are the 3 things that happen in the Praetorium. Now, we're going to come to our final stop. Not the end of our message or the end of our story, but the final stop. And here's the final stop. That's Golgotha. Golgotha meant the mountain of the skull. Basically, that's where all crucifixions took place. That's where Jesus is going to be crucified, on the mountain of the skull. But to get there, he has to carry his cross. Now, we get a couple of different accounts on the carrying of the cross. Luke tells us that the guards turn to Simon of Cyrene, who's there to celebrate the feast, and they say, carry the cross. John says very specifically, Jesus carried the cross himself. Well, which is it? Probably both. And I'll tell you why. There's a term called the Via Dolorosa. That is a Latin term which means the way of sorrows. And the way of sorrows was basically the path that Jesus would have taken from the Praetorium to Golgotha, to where he's going to be crucified. Now, it's about a half mile. So again, to put things in perspective for us, it's about from here to the fairgrounds. Well, I suspect most of us could make that trek. But how many of you can make that trek with your back bleeding? With your head bleeding because of the crown of thorns? Carrying a 300-pound cross? Not many. In fact, to this point, many marvel that Jesus is still alive. Many never made it through the flogging. So now we're at our kind of final destination. And Mark tells us it's from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. He's hung on the cross at noon, and he stays on the cross until 3 o'clock. That's going to bring us to the crucifixion process itself. You know, there's remarkably little written in any of the Gospels about the crucifixion itself, about what occurred and how it occurred. But what we can piece together, looking at Roman history and archaeology, is that the cross would have been laid on the ground, and a spike, probably a little longer and a little wider than this, driven through the feet in order to support who's being crucified, driven through each hand on the crossbar in order to support whoever's been crucified. Then the cross would have been stood up in a pre-dug hole and settled there until the one who is crucified eventually dies. After 3 hours, the Gospels record this. Matthew specifically says, Jesus says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. It basically means, my God, why have you forsaken me? A few minutes later, he says, it is finished. And he gives up his soul. We're still not to the end of our story. I want to come back and finish it up for you, because I want to go back and talk about this guy Barabbas with you. But in the interim, I'd like you, Matt's going to play something for us. I'd like you just to listen to what Matt plays and think about what has occurred over the last 3-hour period. don't know about you, but I can never hear that song without just about falling to my knees and saying, Lord, Lord, Lord. Old rugged cross. Well, I promised you I'd come back and finish up our story. We're not quite finished. Remember Barabbas? Remember I told you, remember his name? And I told you that you'll find him in all four Gospels. Well, who is this Barabbas, and why does he demand so much attention from the Gospel writers? First of all, Barabbas is not a mere thief. He's not a mere criminal. In fact, Luke, in his Gospel, he says he's this. He says he was guilty of insurrection and murder. The most egregious crime that there was in the Roman world at the time was insurrection. Rome, in order to keep their empire together, could not brook anybody in insurrection. Well, Barabbas was probably an insurrectionist, and further, John seems to indicate he was a member of something called the Sikurai. The Sikurai was a word for a short dagger about this long. They were called dagger men. And their whole objective in life was to go through occupied Roman areas, and whenever they found a Roman soldier aside, they would go up behind him and they'd stick the dagger inside him and kill him. That's who Barabbas was. Barabbas was not a thief. Barabbas was an insurrectionist, a murderer, and one of the biggest threats that there was to Rome. Now, the gentleman just did me a favor and handed out some nails to you. I want you to look at your nail for a second. You'll see on the nail, there's a little tag. For those of you who read Hebrew, the tag says Abba. That's the Hebrew name of Barabbas, Abba. Abba means son of the Father. In the earliest of Matthew's Gospels, and still in some today, Matthew gives us one other indication of who this is. He calls him Yeshua Abba. Yeshua, rendered in Greek, is Jesus. Jesus, son of the Father. That was Barabbas. Now, we have I guess we could call it a big theological term that you can, next time you go to a party, you can throw this out. You can say, how about that substitutionary atonement? Right? It's a big theological word. Let me tell you what it means. Substitutionary atonement simply means someone else is paying for the sin that you committed. Someone else is serving the time for the problem that you caused or for the law that you broke. Someone else is standing in your place. Well, it's a pretty simple concept. Somebody else is paying the price for the guilty. That cross, that was Barabbas' cross. That was destined for Barabbas. This flagellum, that was intended for the back of Barabbas. This nail, driven through Jesus' hand and feet, was intended for Barabbas. Yeshua, Bar Yahweh, Jesus, the Son of God, took the place of Jesus, the Son of the Father. That's substitutionary atonement. Someone else paid for his sin. Turn your nail around and look at the back of it. It's blank, isn't it? You know why? That's your nail. Tonight when you go home, I want you to put your name on the nail. And I want you to put it someplace where when you look at it, you can say, Jesus paid the price for my sin. Because the reality is, that's your nail. That's your cross. This is your flagellum. Jesus paid the price. That's substitutionary atonement. That's the story behind what happens on Good Friday. Someone else died for my sin. Well, our story's almost over, but here's the reality. It's not going to be over until Sunday. That's going to be the end of our story. We're just at kind of intermission now. There's a song that the cathedrals did that it's another one of those things. I find myself, if I'm playing the cathedrals driving down Wolf Creek Pass, I need to pull over because I soon find myself driving about 90 miles an hour. Not something you want to do on Wolf Creek Pass. There's a song that the cathedrals do that I'm going to ask Alexander to play for us. And then I'm going to ask him, Pastor Alexander, I'm going to ask him to come up and do a closing prayer. And then I'd like all of us just to go home and think about our nail.